There are a number of myths and counter-myths involving the end of World War II. It was Russia declaring war, not the atomic bombs, that convinced Japan to surrender. Not dropping the bombs would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives during the invasion. But perhaps my favorite is the Leaflets. Critics of the use of the atomic bomb make it sound like the bombs weren't dropped out of necessity, but out of some sort of bloodthirsty rage or even morbid curiosity.
And they haven't used the bomb yet and are curious to see if it works, so they drop it on Japan. They actually dropped 2.
But they leave out the fact that weeks prior to the bombing, the US dropped leaflets on 36 Japanese cities, warning civilians that these cities would be bombed and to evacuate, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Critics of the leaflets point out that it doesn't specifically say atomic bomb, and the picture is of B-29s dropping firebombs. But remember, this is 1945. Atomic bomb wasn't really in anyone's vocabulary, so explicitly saying atomic bomb wouldn't really make sense to the, forgive the pun here, target audience. And what difference would it make? This is Tokyo after being firebombed, and this is Hiroshima after being atomic bombed. It doesn't matter whether it's one bomb or hundreds, the effect is basically the same. In fact, more people died in Tokyo than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. After Hiroshima, we started dropping leaflets specifically saying,
"We are in possession of the most destructive explosive ever devised by man. If you still have any doubt, make inquiry as to what happened to Hiroshima."
This was somewhat of a bluff though, because we only had the 2 and we used both of them. We wouldn't have another one for several weeks. But they didn't know that. A few weeks ago, I was asked by Theosratched to respond to a Twitter rant regarding Winston Churchill. I won't respond to the entire thing in this video, but link down below. It got me thinking about the many ways that people pluck out pieces of history, maybe dust off some of the context and embellish parts in order to make it fit whatever story they want to tell. While the Twitter thread itself never mentions it, several others commented that Winston Churchill didn't care about Australia and said things like, "Let the Japanese have it." Australians often call this the Great Betrayal, and this is somewhat of a mischaracterization. After the fall of France in 1940, when the Battle of Britain started, the British met with the Americans to figure out a strategy for World War II. They agreed on 2 major points.
The Atlantic and European areas were the decisive theater, and as such would be the primary focus of US military efforts. A defensive strategy in the Far East Pacific.
This is commonly referred to as the Germany First plan. There was no plan to cede territory to the Japanese just to get it back later. In fact, one of the subpoints was,
"The security of the British Commonwealth must be maintained in all circumstance, including the retention of a Far East position."
Both the US and Britain agreed that since Nazi Germany was rapidly expanding and on Britain's doorstep, that it was the greatest threat and even the backbone of the Axis powers, so it should be the primary focus of the war. But the US wasn't in the war yet. We were not so covertly helping Britain, France, and Russia, but not officially. Of course, all of that changed on December 7th, 1941.
A date which will live in infamy.
There's seriously so much to say about Pearl Harbor, but I want to focus in on the conspiracy theory that FDR let Pearl Harbor happen in order to justify getting into the war. This is a real conspiracy theory. You can look it up. There are dozens of videos and books on the topic. The main problem here is that they're focusing on just Pearl Harbor, like they have historical tunnel vision or something. To be fair, when we look back, it's the only one we talk about since it was on the front page of every newspaper and even got entire Michael Bay explosions devoted to it. In the December 7th, 1941,
a date which will live in infamy,
speech given by John Voight in the movie, he says,
"The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American military forces. I regret to tell you that over 3,000 American lives have been lost."
Which makes it seem like Hawaii was the only place that was attacked. But as accurate as that movie is, that's an abridged version of the speech.
I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya.
Last night, Japanese forces attacked
Hong Kong,
Last night, Japanese forces attacked
Guam,
Last night, Japanese forces attacked.
the Philippine Islands,
Last night, the Japanese attacked.
Wake Island,
And this morning, the Japanese attacked.
Midway Island. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area.
Saying that FDR let Pearl Harbor happen is a myopic view of history that strips away the fact that dozens of islands and countries across the Pacific were all attacked at once. Pearl Harbor was by far the most important to the American military, but it certainly wasn't the only one. American entry into World War II was inevitable at this point. FDR didn't need to sacrifice nearly every US territory in the Pacific, thousands of American lives, 5 battleships, and dozens of other smaller ships in order to justify it.
Ah, but what about the carriers?
Stan, okay.
At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, aircraft carriers were still somewhat of a novelty and curiosity. We only had 3 in the Pacific Fleet. The undisputed pride of the US Navy was its battleships, 8 of which were in Pearl Harbor that day. The primary objective of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was to disable the battleships. They launched the attack knowing that the carriers weren't in the harbor, but not caring because they weren't seen as important. A major part of the conspiracy is that the carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor, suggesting that FDR thought they were more important than any admiral and moved them out of the harbor so that they wouldn't be destroyed in the coming attack. So where were they? The USS Lexington was delivering dive bombers to Midway. The USS Saratoga was in San Diego, and the USS Enterprise had just finished delivering a squadron of fighters to Wake Island and was returning to Pearl Harbor that morning. Many of its fighters actually participated in the defense of Pearl Harbor ahead of the carrier's arrival. Ben Affleck and Josh Hartnett weren't the only ones flying around that day. All of these missions were planned separately weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The reason people find this suspicious is that aircraft carriers were key to our victory over Japan. This is historical hindsight at its worst. Think about it, what did we have after Pearl Harbor since all of our battleships were either damaged or sunk? Aircraft carriers. So we were forced to use what we had left, and we suddenly realized that these former novelty items were actually pretty dang useful. Once America declared war on Japan, anti-Japanese sentiment exploded. Americans were suspicious of any Japanese person living in America, thinking that they might be spies or saboteurs. Which, remember this scene from Pearl Harbor?
Do you have any air tours going through the Valley of Oahu? You do.
Yeah, that actually happened. His name was Tadashi Morimura, or actually Takeo Yoshikawa, though we didn't find out about him until way after the war. Suspicions and racial tensions were excessively high, and as a result, FDR signed an executive order that moved all people of Japanese ancestry from the western states to internment camps in the interior of the country. Many people who want to make this event sound as bad as possible call them concentration camps. And I guess by literal definition they could be considered concentration camps. But also by literal definition, if you try to kill more than one person, that's genocide. It's the connotation, the background meaning that's evoked when you hear the phrase that's important. When you hear concentration camp, you think of that one specific concentration camp, when they weren't at all comparable in terms of purpose or end result. They weren't labor camps or death camps. In fact, more people came out of the camps than went in. Yes, people died, but the death toll in the internment camps was actually no higher than the outside civilian population, and there were more births than deaths.
Adults could work if they wanted to for a measly salary of $5 a day.
$5 a day sounds awfully low, but we're in 2018. They were paid $5 in 1942 money, which is almost $80 today. To put that into perspective, a private in the US military in 1942 made $50 a month. Measly is an added adjective to make it sound worse. I'm not saying that the conditions weren't awful, but internment camp is a perfectly acceptable term for what they were. As awful as Heart Mountain, Wyoming might have been, it wasn't Auschwitz. When you exaggerate everything, you diminish everything. When everything is the worst thing that ever happened, nothing is.
And when everyone's super, no one will be.
We should all be able to agree that internment camps and concentration camps were both bad, but one of them was clearly worse. The camps were absolutely racially motivated and without any hard evidence of military necessity. 2/3 of the internees were US citizens, and I'm willing to bet all of them were loyal to the United States. I personally don't agree with it, but when it's put into the wider historical context, I can at least try to understand it. But I'm saying that with 2018 hindsight. Get it? Like 2020, but I thought it was funny. When talking about the internment camps, people often point to Hawaii as an odd example. Since that's where the attack on Pearl Harbor happened and over a third of the population was Japanese, and they weren't rounded up into camps. They usually say something to the effect of how devastating it would have been to the economy.
The military governor of Hawaii actually said, please don't do this, you can't do it, it's impractical, we can never pull it off, and you're gonna wreck the territory's economy. Just leave it alone.
Did you catch that? Because it's really subtle.
Military governor.
Hawaii did have an internment camp. It only held about 1,400 people, but more importantly, the entire island was placed under martial law, as in barbed wire on the beaches, tanks in the streets, freaks in the sheets, martial law. Hawaii wasn't some liberal paradise that got along in racial harmony despite the war. There were travel restrictions, no radio stations, curfews, and even a blackout. This meant that you had to cover all of your doors and windows, you weren't allowed to light fires, and you weren't allowed to drive with your headlights on at night. This was done so that the Japanese bombers flying overhead wouldn't be able to find their targets. Not that they ever even tried bombing at night, but still. They even printed special money just for Hawaii so that if it ever got invaded, the US government could just render it completely useless. So saying that Hawaii didn't have a camp and they didn't round up all of the Japanese is inaccurate, because the entire territory was on military lockdown, like one giant internment camp. But there were some Japanese Americans, mostly from Hawaii, who joined the military.
One of the last German units to see action in World War II was the 33rd Waffen Grenadier Division, which participated in the defense of central Berlin, and that was comprised of French volunteers. And of course, some Japanese people fought for America in the Second World War. The 442nd Infantry Regiment of the United States Army was made up almost entirely of soldiers of Japanese ancestry.
These two units are not at all comparable. The 33rd Waffen Grenadier Division was made up of French people from France fighting for the Germans against France. The 442nd Infantry Regiment was made up of Japanese people from America fighting for America against the Germans. Yeah, the reason why is actually both smart and a little racist. They were assigned to Europe not because they thought that the Japanese would defect, but because they were worried that other Americans would mistake them for the enemy. There weren't a lot of enemy Japanese people running around Europe at the time, so yeah. They were American soldiers fighting for America. They weren't at all traitors to their nation. In the aftermath of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was broken up, Britain got control of a large section of the Middle East. It's actually a pretty interesting story. Someone should make a video about that.
Would you like to know more?
The very first tweet in that Churchill rant was about the British occupation of Afghanistan.
Afghanistan's not part of the Middle East.
All right, Stan. Okay.
While he was there, Churchill discovered his passion for war and viewed the Pashtuns as beneath him, going so far as saying that all who resist will be killed without quarter, that they needed to recognize the superiority of race. He wrote about how we systematically, village by village, destroyed the houses, filled up the wells, blew down the towers, cut down the shady trees, burned the crops, and broke the reservoirs in punitive devastation.
That makes Churchill look pretty bad, right? Well, I have a question for you. What year is this? He rather conveniently leaves that information out, because it's 1897.
1897's not even close to World War II.
Stan, okay?
Churchill is a 22-year-old war correspondent for The Telegraph. He's not exactly prime minister or in charge of anything. And everything he is quoted as saying is wartime propaganda. We do the same thing for every single war.
I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments.
I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm just saying that it makes a lot more sense once you put it in context.
Churchill was Secretary of State for the colonies in 21. This is when he decided air power was superior to troops on the ground, and he bombed the out of any resistance.
He advocated for the use of the Air Force rather than ground troops because it was cheaper. No other reason, really.
I am strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against the uncivilized tribes. It would spread a lively terror.
But that isn't the full quote, is it? No, it isn't.
I am strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. The morale effect should be so good that the loss of life should be reduced to a minimum. It is not necessary to use only the most deadly gases. Gases can be used which cause great inconvenience and would spread a lively terror, and yet would leave no serious permanent effects on most of those affected.
He advocated for the use of non-lethal tear gas to subdue rebellions. It's pretty important to note that they never actually used any gas of any kind. He just kind of suggested it. But there is one Arab revolt that he doesn't bring up. The Anglo-Iraqi War. The thing about revolts and independence movements in the middle of a war is that you never really know who's behind it. Is it a natural uprising from within, or is it being funded and supported by your enemy? The Germans did this a lot. In fact, during World War I, they tried it in Afghanistan against the British, which didn't work. They tried to get Mexico to start a war with the United States in order to keep the Americans occupied and out of Europe, which also didn't work. In order to get Russia out of the war, they funded and sent Vladimir Lenin to start an internal coup, which did work. Rather famously, actually. And Spain didn't participate in World War II because it had just finished fighting an internal civil war, supported by the Nazis. So it shouldn't surprise you to know that the leader of this Iraqi revolt was the Ba'ath Party. Yes, the same Ba'ath Party that this guy was part of. Supported by, say it with me, Germany. Or the Nazis, whichever one you said. Revolts and independence movements during a war are never a good idea for this very reason. They're gonna crack down on you even harder. You can't pick and choose revolts that you think were unjustly put down while ignoring ones that you know were justly put down, because you're coming at it with 70+ years of extra knowledge. In the moment, whether it's funded by the enemy or a natural uprising of the people, it all looks the same. I got a lot of flack for saying that during my video on Gandhi, with people commenting things like,
"No reason why a country can't fight for independence instead of waging a war in Europe."
India wasn't fighting in Europe, they were fighting in India. Indians were fighting against the Japanese, who were right here. This is India. So when the enemy is right at your doorstep and you start demanding independence, it raises some questions is all I'm saying. But the Twitter rant mentions India as well.
He orchestrated a mass genocide in Bengal. It was a famine in the same sense that we had a famine over here. He starved over 4 million Bengalis in 1943.
It was actually only 2 million, not that that makes it any better. This bit right here is Bengal. It's part of India and also happens to be the front line. So food was often shipped back from the front line and reserved for the military, and whenever the Japanese would advance, they'd burn it all so that it wouldn't be captured. So there was a famine.
Churchill refused all said to Bengal. Canada and US offered rice and he refused.
What?
Your first clue that this is false should be that Canada and the US aren't exactly known for their bountiful agriculture of rice. They offered wheat, not rice. But Churchill declined it because it would take over 2 months to ship it, and that's assuming it made it through all of this mess. The United States didn't offer anything, that part is just plain made up. In fact, in 1944, when Churchill wrote to FDR asking for help, saying,
"I am seriously concerned about the food situation in India. I have had much hesitation in asking you to add to the great assistance you are giving us with shipping, but a satisfactory situation in India is of such vital importance to the success of our joint plans against the Japanese that I am impelled to ask you to consider a special allocation of ships to carry wheat to India."
FDR refused for the exact same reasons that Churchill declined Canada's offer. Instead, Churchill ordered Australia to ship 350,000 tons of wheat, although the reallocation of ships was still an issue given the upcoming Normandy invasion. The writer of these tweets, and indeed many of the other things that I've mentioned, seem to want to pluck these events out of World War II and talk about them as if they were the only things going on at the time. It's only when you put it in the larger context that things make sense. This isn't always nefarious, it has a lot to do with just how we tell stories. Nobody wants to hear about the second worst time something happened. Just like with people, we want to label events as either good or bad, but that's not interesting enough. It also has to be the worst. Not everyone was as bad as Hitler, and not everything was as bad as the Holocaust. The actual history is bad enough. Exaggerating, embellishing, or cherry-picking events out of context just casts doubt on the rest of history, especially if the person ever finds out that there's more to the story. So the next time you see someone being labeled as a genocidal maniac, gee, where have I seen that before? Or hear that people were being rounded up into concentration camps, maybe look into the story a bit more, because now you know better. Does this change how you view any historical events or figures? What event from history should I contextualize next? Let me know down in the comments, and don't forget to turn that subscribe button. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and join us on the subreddit.